Today's topic is on South Africa after Mandela. There was a lot of talk in the lead up to Mandela's passing that this would be a watershed moment for that country, 20 years after the end of apartheid and just under 20 since first free, fair elections, if we can call them that. And to get a better grasp, I think, of what the future holds for South Africa, we have invited two speakers who have a great deal of knowledge of that country and who both have deep attachment to it that goes back many decades. Ken Davis will be speaking first. He's had 20 years with Aid Abroad-APHEDA, most of that time on South Africa. He was a member of the anti-apartheid struggle, an activist here in Australia from 1971. Please welcome Ken.
I was saying to the people that invited me they should get a South African, and that I've been to South Africa working mainly with COSATU, the unions, on and off since 91. I first went there in 91 for the first trade union conference on AIDS in South Africa. And so my association with South Africa through APHEDA has mainly been in relation to the South African trade unions. But if I say political opinions, they're formed through friendships in South Africa and don't reflect my organisation or the ACTU, of course. Well, I was embarrassed that it wasn't a South African. I was looking at a map of Sydney that SBS has got about where people, each suburb, which is the largest birthplace country for each suburb. And of course that's a bit interesting. What struck me is there's so many suburbs that are coloured pink that the largest number of non-Australians is South African. And disproportionately, they're not really in Western Sydney or Southwestern Sydney. But it's having a big connection with the South African community and all its diversity in Australia, it really shocked me. So I don't know why a non-South African is here. I think tonight's really interesting. I think if we think about what's in the mass media or what's reached people in Australia in the last couple of years, there's essentially maybe four issues. The first, almost 2 years ago, was the killing of 44 people, 34 of them striking mine workers at Marikana near Rustenburg at the Longmin mine. And that really shocked a lot of people in the labour movement here, because it was a very hard thing to understand. It's quite a hard thing still to understand. And Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa, who's on the board of Longmin, has been in the tribunal investigating that in the last couple of days. The second was the death of Nelson Mandela in December 2013, which I guess was long expected, and he'd been secluded from political knowledge, actually. They kept all news away from him for the last couple of years, so he couldn't make any comments against the government. But what was very interesting in the memorial at the stadium and in the funeral was a lot of very interesting political signals about the volatility of South African politics that were interesting to decode. The next, of course, is the elections in May, which ANC did reasonably well. I think a bit unexpectedly, and that was the 20th anniversary of the democratic elections. And so in connection with that, there's a lot to analyse about what's going on in the ruling alliance. And it's an alliance, it was a government of national unity, but more recently it's a government, officially the alliance of the ANC and some of the former apartheid-era parties, the Communist Party, and the Congress of South African Trade Unions. So the governing party is effectively that alliance, which is quite important in understanding the conflict at the moment within that alliance. In relation to the 20th anniversary, just to say there's an exhibition on the 11th of September in Customs House, which will subsequently go to tour South Africa, which is officially to commemorate the history of the anti-apartheid movement in Australia. So there's a lot going on in relation to the 20th anniversary, a lot of official efforts by the South African government. They've had a lot of unfortunate meetings with ministers from the Office of the Presidency trying to cultivate business in Australia and South Africans in Australia to support the current government, saying that there's no poverty in South Africa, the problem is the refugees, essentially extraordinarily right-wing lines that are not credible either for Australian business people and certainly not for any South Africans in Australia. The other issue I think that brings South Africa to the news, which is somewhat hard to analyse, is its engagement in the BRICS, the alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and the impact that that might have at a time when the hegemony of the United States is somewhat in decline. But beyond those issues, it's very hard for us here to understand the level of conflict inside the South African political class, if you want. Before the election in 1994, a lot of people in the ANC, and immediately before the election, because the election in 94, I don't think anyone assumed would be a success until about 10 days before the election. And in that time, a lot of people said, we're going to get Lebanon or we're going to get Brazil. What they meant was, if the process failed, they would have decades of internal civil war between people of different nationalities, effectively, or ethnicities. That didn't happen, and I mean, thank God. And that's a tribute to the strength of the African National Congress. By getting Brazil, what they meant was that they would have a nationally unified democracy with reasonably progressive politics, but with outrageous and deepening inequality. And in fact, the people that said that back in 94, that's exactly what's happened. So the problem is, in the drift from a radical program that Mandela was elected on in 1994, within a year and a half, the leadership around Thabo Mbeki in the party had overturned that more social democratic program and put forward effectively a very neoliberal, almost Thatcherite policy called the Growth Economic GEAR. I can't remember it. But it was essentially a neoliberal policy which brought together the compromise that the South African leadership had done with both international capital and with domestic capital. So that's led to, under the Thabo Mbeki presidency, their interpretation of the Communist Party's policy. Communist Party is dominant in the government and has been dominant in the government since 1994. Is the National Democratic Revolution, and that is a two-stage revolution where the process now is to make a qualities form of capitalism, to unleash capitalism's productive forces, and within that to strengthen the leadership of the working class to make a redistributive or a developmental state. So that's the contradiction between having a country which has a highly developed, advanced capitalist economy and now a very wealthy elite with the pressure on the government to have a developmental state or a distributive state that has some benefit to the masses. That and the creation within that, the explicit point of the Thabo Mbeki period was to de-racialise the capitalist elite and to create an upper middle class of black people. And that was very explicit. The demand of people in leadership, and they're not the old timers that did the struggle, but the people coming into governmental leadership were wanting material benefits similar to what the people in the old regime had had. And that's really what's happened. In terms of polarisation and poverty, I'm using official statistics, which I think are probably wildly inaccurate and wildly optimistic. Officially, there's around 52 million people in the country. There's an unknown number of refugees, possibly 3 million alone from Zimbabwe. Of that population, officially 8.5 million are workers. That includes part-time workers, casual workers, full-time workers, and a lot of workers in the agricultural sector or in the informal economy. So that's not a big, wage earning group of people as a percentage of the population. Now officially, almost 80% of people have formal housing of some sort, meaning not cardboard and not, badly constructed shacks. 70% have access to water. and 80% have got electricity connected, but it doesn't mean that they can pay for the electricity. Life expectancy has gone back up to 56 years. The primary reason why South African life expectancy plummeted was the depth of HIV. There's now 6 million people have been diagnosed with HIV, of whom 2 million are on antiretroviral treatments. I'll come back to that. It's 18% of the general adult population, much, much higher in some provinces like KwaZulu-Natal, where it's over 1/3. So in terms of poverty, South Africa in the last couple of years overtook Brazil in terms of inequality. So its Gini rating, which is the calculation of inequality, is 0.69. So it's verging on the tragic level. In terms of consumption, the richest fifth of the population consumes 61%, and the poorest fifth only 4%. The minimum wages, for example, in hospitality industry, is around $300 Australian per month. That's the legal minimum wage. Of course, a lot of people wouldn't get anywhere near the legal minimum wage, and a lot of people are not working full time. Now, $300 a month doesn't sound a lot, but it sounds a lot more than, say, Cambodia. The problem in South Africa is the standard of living is not that different. Not the standard of living, the cost of living. So food prices are not dramatically different from here. If you go to a supermarket in Johannesburg, you're paying approximately the same amount. So if the bulk of your working class is on $300 a month, and your working class is a small minority of the population, you can understand that in absolute terms, poverty in South Africa now is much, much worse than in the early 90s. And that's the dilemma, that you've got a government that on the one hand is committed to neoliberalism, on the other hand is committed to distributive policies and a developmental state. Sorry for sounding very contradictory. I think I don't want to sound pessimistic. I think the most exciting thing about South Africa is the strength of the labour movement and the social movements. I'll come back to talk about the labour movement because it's probably the most volatile and interesting class struggle anywhere at the moment. In terms of the social movements, the most important social movement post-apartheid was 1998, led by Zaki Ahmed and a few other people. That was the Treatments Action Campaign, which for the first time mobilised vast numbers of people and for the first time enabled people with HIV to come out publicly. And through a very skilled mass mobilisation strategy, they initially backed the South African government against the international drug companies with the lawsuit against Novartis in terms of being able to sell generic antiretrovirals. But then, as Thabo Mbeki became more and more powerful, they ended up opposing the denialism of the South African government, where the health minister and the president were saying HIV doesn't exist, HIV doesn't cause AIDS, no one's got HIV, I don't know anyone with HIV. If you take lemon juice and garlic and extra virgin olive oil, then most people don't know what virgin olive oil is. It's like a salad thing, for Africans it's what white people do for salad. So they were saying that by eating these three things you'll get healthy. People then were saying, well, if the president doesn't tell us to wear condoms, why would we wear condoms? So many calculations about the impact of the government policy in relation to HIV were that 500,000 or 1 million people died, 1 million extra people died of HIV during the presidency of Thabo Mbeki. So the Treatments Action Campaign became this model.
You're right.
Sorry?
You're right.
Yeah. The thing about the Treatments Action Campaign was it was the invention of a post-apartheid social movement that was founded on mass mobilisation, a proper attitude to the churches, the trade unions and everybody, a proper attitude to the political parties that was thoroughly based in mass movement. And it succeeded. And its victory was important worldwide. Had Treatments Action Campaign not won in South Africa, we wouldn't have 14 million people around the world on antiretrovirals today. And its impact was important here as well. There's mass movements around health. And when I'm talking about mass movements, the last time I was in South Africa, everywhere I went, there were struggles. And when I say struggles, I mean people in the street, people fighting. That is in every township, outside, in every university campus, outside most factories, everywhere you go, there is live struggle. So the other mass movement is around health and around health access. The government promised to give primary health care to everybody. I think officially it's for pregnant women and people under 6 years old, but in fact the delivery of primary health care is very flawed, and millions of people can't get any level of primary health care. The other mass movements around housing, you might have heard of the struggle of the shack dwellers, in the Durban area. So millions of people are still without formal housing, or without any, when I say formal housing, it could be very modest formal housing, but there's still millions and millions of people living in cardboard or living in bits of tin. There's a big struggle around access to education. Officially, you should be able to go to a government school free, but in reality, the ability of millions of people to do that is not there. In terms of jobs, South Africa's lost a lot of jobs since 1994 because of the integration of South Africa into global capital. So, for example, as soon as capital could move, it moved. As soon as people could import cheap clothing from Asia, they did. So hundreds of thousands of clothing workers, for example, lost their jobs, and that's never been replaced. Around water and energy, it is still a real struggle for most people in most areas, and most people are still living in apartheid areas. That is that although the white suburbs have been deracialised, the bulk of people live in exactly the same areas where they were dumped under apartheid, and those areas don't have facilities. So people don't really have good access to clean water, to sanitation, or to electricity. And electricity is like user pays, and so a lot of people are just cut off because they don't have money to pay at any given time. There's an area we've got projects still in South Africa with the farm workers, Workers' World Radio, which is part of the union movement, where we've got a donated project in what used to be called Port Elizabeth, in a township called Mission Vale, which is a salt pan. It's got 130,000 people and 16 taps.
Wow.
And strangely enough, they didn't vote for the ANC. It's across the road from a big hospital, which has been there for, 15 years, where half the wards are not open because they can't pay staff. And it's across the road from what used to be Vista University, now Nelson Mandela University, which again is only half operative. So there's, at a grassroots level, people are struggling because they have to struggle, because they've got no other alternative. There's big struggle around food. So the cost of food is quite high. South Africa exports to Europe, so the quality of food available is not good. And for a lot of communities, there's food insecurity. So in Cape Town, in the fishing areas in Cape Town, in Hout Bay, for example, there's 3 communities. The African community, the South African squatter township, the kids are suffering malnutrition but are obese because what they're buying is chicken feet cooked in fat and chips. In the coloured township, children are food insecure and they have wastage because they don't, they simply have malnutrition. And for the Zimbabwean squatter township also, kids are literally starving. So food insecurity is a real problem in a lot of areas. There's big struggles about land. Despite what the government's been saying on and off since 1994, there's virtually no land redistribution. And so agriculture is overwhelmingly still in the commercial sector, and that the peasantry, if you want, is still extremely small. And that's causing untold suffering, particularly, for example, in the Western Cape, where you've got very, very large money-coloured communities where people are paid next to nothing for working on farms, but are not really able to develop smallholder farming. Transport's a big problem. There's virtually no public transport functioning, even though at the time of the first election the Japanese government said to Nelson Mandela, "Here's $200 million for public transport in Johannesburg." But like almost all overseas aid at the time, what that meant was $200 million worth of foreign experts to argue with each other about the nature of public transport. So that's a very difficult situation because working people in South Africa, it's very, very hard to get to your job. So you go in group taxis usually, but the absence of safe, effective public transport, and we're talking about very big cities, Cape Town, Durban, Johannesburg are very, very large cities, and because people are living in the apartheid era settlements, if you want, the distance they need to travel to get to their work is very, very hard, very long. So there's a lot of struggles around public transport and about the cost of transport. So there's a big fight between the unions and the government about tollways, because if the cost of the tollways is too great, it means that working people are very compromised in terms of them being able to get to work. There's a lot of mass struggles around violence. We were told by the government just a little while ago that there's now virtually no crime in South Africa, which is an unusual concept. I mean, what really happened was quite a long while ago, they passed a law saying that you weren't allowed to report crime statistics. But there's very vibrant struggles, particularly around gender-based violence, and that's been true since the early 90s. And there's still a resilience, particularly in the lesbian and gay movement and in the women's movement. So these are also quite mass social struggles. There's a lot of struggles of international solidarity. There's a real problem with xenophobia in South Africa in some communities and violence towards Somalis to Zimbabweans. But on the other hand, there's some big struggles in solidarity. Solidarity with, for democracy in Swaziland, for example. Solidarity with Zimbabwe, although that's compromised by the terrible attitude of the government towards the Mugabe dictatorship, which of course is completely against the heritage of Nelson Mandela. But most importantly with Palestine. So the idea that Israel is implementing apartheid is extremely popular in South Africa amongst a whole lot of people. So Archbishop Tutu has been leading this. Former President Thabo Mbeki just came out calling for sanctions and boycott of Israel. The leadership of civil society in South Africa fully backs the idea that, which I think is a little bit awkward, that what Israel is doing is apartheid. There was a demonstration, arguably, of 200,000 or 100,000 in Cape Town a couple of days ago about the Gaza war, calling for boycott. And this is really interesting because South Africa and Israel, of course, had a military alliance back before, 1994, a very close military alliance. So the symbolism of having what they say is the largest demonstration in recent history in South Africa in Cape Town in solidarity with Gaza is very interesting. Now why I'm saying all of that is all these struggles are alive, and they're alive everywhere in South Africa. And the dedication and the talent of people involved in these struggles is of inspiration for everyone in the world. And that's what we're not hearing. So it's not just like the terrible contradiction in the South African economy or politics, but it's what we can learn from the struggles. And for example, the understanding of food sovereignty is probably the sharpest anywhere in the world in South Africa. Now I just want to talk a bit about the unions. There's three big federations in South Africa. The Congress of South African Trade Unions, which is the unification of the militant unions inside the country with the South African trade unions in exile. And it's got about 2 million members. And it's probably one of the most dynamic union movements in the world. The other is NACTU. I can't remember what NACTU stands for, but it's essentially from the history of the Pan-Africanist Congress, and it derives from the time when the ANC split between people that were a bit inclined towards Moscow and people that were a bit inclined towards Beijing. So it's got a sort of Maoist heritage, but it's got about 500,000 members, the largest union of which is mining and construction, and they're the people that were shot in Marikana at the Rustenburg platinum mines. The third union, Fiducia, is a bit more conservative and comes from the apartheid era unions, although of course now it's majority black. I just wanted to say the big instability in the African National Congress leadership, and that was very sharp around the question of succession to Zuma, or who would go for president, in these last elections, or who would succeed Zuma, and that's been a very difficult question. That's refracted in the two other parts of the governing alliance. That is, there's a very active conflict within the Communist Party, and more importantly, essentially between the members and the leadership, and more importantly within the Congress of South African Trade Unions. So even today there's a lot of news about the impending split of COSATU, and I think there was a congress by the metal workers, NUMSA, which was an international congress about really what's political strategy. So NUMSA, which is the largest union in COSATU, which announced it would no longer support the ANC at the last elections, and which, you know, there's quite a terrible split in COSATU, with unions loyal to the leadership of the Communist Party, like the Mine Workers Union, versus unions that essentially support the General Secretary Vavi. And it's a bit more complicated than that. But the General Secretary was suspended because of sexual harassment, but in a very complicated conflict involving the Communist Party leadership. Now the ANC is making an intervention into COSATU to tell people to behave, but the question is, will NUMSA be thrown out of COSATU? What it's doing is talking about a new Workers' Party, which will be in opposition to the African National Congress and in fact to the Communist Party. And why they're saying that is that the leadership is interested in its own benefit, that the Communist Party is trapped in the ANC leadership by having the majority of the national ministries, the majority of the state premier positions, and that the membership of the unions and of the Communist Party is angry at the non-delivery of basic things to working people in South Africa. So I don't know where that's going to go. I mean, people have been talking about a split in the alliance to form a genuine Workers' Party for a long while. But now this situation is much more serious than at any time in the past, and it's pregnant with possibility. So just to recapitulate on the political conflict in terms of the ANC, you've got the leadership of the ANC around Zuma, backed up by the leadership of the Communist Party, and backed up by some unions like the National Union of Mine Workers. You've got people on the right, so the white, essentially the white opposition, the Democratic Alliance, got around 22% of the vote in the last elections, and they had people like, they had some people from the left, like Mandela Rampelli, the former girlfriend of Steve Biko, and Patricia DeLille from the Pan-Africanist Congress leading them temporarily recently. So it's not as straightforward as I'm making out. You've got the populist movement around Julius Malema and his boyfriend Fred from the northern province, from Limpopo. Now I think they're essentially very self-serving, rich, corrupt populists. But 1 million people voted for them because what they're demanding is what they're seen to demand is nationalisation of the banks and the mines. What Julius Malema is actually demanding is that they be given to him and people like him. But at a township level, their messages about economic freedom and why are we still poor are deeply resonant with a lot of people. So they're essentially another wing, and they've been, Malema was expelled and his party got, I think, around 4% of the vote in the national elections. And then on the left, you've got the Metal Workers Union, like I said, and part of the Congress of Trade Unions. A lot of the members of the Communist Party, the General Secretary of COSATU, Vavi, who's clearly the most important figure voicing, if you want, anti-capitalist politics in the face of the government, and a regroupment of what was the far left with people from the Communist Party and the unions, including former communist leaders like Ronnie Kasrils, who was in the first governments of national unity as Minister of Security, around the Democratic Left Front, and that's cooperating with the metal workers in the question of whether to build a broad left party outside the ANC alliance. Now, where that's going to go in the next couple of days, I don't think anyone knows. But that's where we're up to at the moment.
Thank you.